Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Good to see such a nice big crowd. Okay, a few things that crossed my desk in the month since we were here last. If you've ever heard of the Titan T51, it's a home-built, well, a factory-built Mustang, modernised ones. You won't be seeing any more of them because the builder had a propeller, complete destruction propeller, and went into the trees afterwards. And so that wiped out his aircraft and him and probably the factory. So that's gone. Brazil, the ATR 72 that did what looked like a flat spin. Yes. It might be described as otherwise because we don't know the reason for the thing, but it certainly looked like a flat spin to me. Yeah. Be a horrible feeling. They're very hard to get out of. These guys up front might have been working real hard. And then, of course, there was the Cairns helicopter. Perfect example of, it seemed like a good idea at the time, Your Honour. Just, he was put to bed by his mates and later got up, thought it was a good idea. Looked very much to me like he was going to do a high-speed pass and misjudged it by a few feet. In the dark, in the rain. The Osprey crash, we had some 2 years ago, I think it was now. The result of the crash was fatigue and non-compliance with standing orders, basically, apparently. That's what they've said. And the other thing that's been in the news was the MRH-90, the Taipan. Yeah. In their tests of using the night vision goggles, people who were doing the tests found them so dangerous they stopped testing them. It was always my impression that the aircraft probably at night flew into the water, especially in that circumstance there where you don't have a horizon. There's no lights. You're out in the in far north Queensland. The lights are few and far between. They're flying very low, no horizon. So easy to just drop down that little bit. Of course, Rex, Aviation fell over, entered a trading halt on the 29th of July, went into administration. Saab flights continue, 737s halted. Mellor and the Pilot Academy remain outside the administration and are still operating. And Virgin has taken over 3 of the Rex 737 leases. So the aeroplanes haven't left the country. Again, my impression, tried to do too much. You know, they were doing very well but the trouble was they were up for replacements with the Saabs anyway. They'd reached their limit. That might have had a lot to do with it. So the government has guaranteed regional flight bookings for Rex customers throughout the administration process. That is, if Rex finally kicks up and isn't able to actually do the flights, the government will pay them back. They still don't get to fly. On the 22nd of July, only the second airworthy and 8th complete Curtiss Helldiver flew again after a 12-year restoration by Fagan fighters in the USA. 79 years since its last previous flight, which had ended in a fatal crash, and it burned and had been through trees. So I don't know how much of the original is left, but grandfather's axe, it's flying again. 31st of July, Western Sydney Airport announced as 80% complete after the terminal building was waterproofed. So there's only 20% of that left to go. We'll start seeing aeroplanes, well, who knows. The next Red Arrow's fallen Gnat has begun restoration to fly in New Zealand. First one in the Southern Hemisphere, I think. Back to Rex for a moment. Paul Scurrah had offered the group 160 mil to buy them, and they rejected it back in 2300. And 2023. Poor old Alan Joyce. He lost $9 million, the poor bastard. We'll do a little take up for him later. Virgin Australia has ordered 8 Embraer E190s to replace their Fokker fleet. Anybody go to the last weekend's Gold Coast Air Show? Enjoy it?
Yeah.
Good. Just one? 2? Anybody try and watch it on YouTube? Every time I turned over to it, it was either frozen or green screen. A couple of things for the future. One of them very, very close. Tomorrow, Queensland Air Museum is hosting the annual Aviation Museum Conference, and Muggins is talking at 9:30. So it's going to be a quick turnaround for me. And my basic thing is to explain to them how QAM grew out of AHSA. Not AHSA Q, because we weren't Q back in those days. We were just AHSA. And Caboolture is having a fly-in on the 7th and 8th. The fly-in is the 7th and the fly-out is the 8th. All vintage aeroplanes, well worth a visit. 9 o'clock is the sort of posted arrival time. I'll be there. Always enjoy that. And the other thing that is us, we are having an end-of-year lunch for members and partners at the Lucky Star Tavern at Sunnybank Hills on Monday, the 18th of November at 12 noon, and $10 for financial AHSA members will be subsidised. And if you'd like to attend, send an email to Peter. And that is about all that.
One more accident.
One more.
The Spitfire accident in the UK.
Yes.
Flown by a
Battle of Britain one.
Memorial flight.
Yes. That was last month.
Last month.
We haven't heard anything more about it yet.
No.
Okay, so tonight our speaker is Bill Mellor, and he will talk, we hope, that's what he's told us he's going to do and talk about anyway, about the rehabilitation of Australian Army aviation since the mid-40s to today. Take it away, Bill.
Thanks very much. Okay, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me along to talk about a topic that is very dear to my heart. It's the rebirth of modern Army aviation from the mid-40s until today. My presentation will go along these lines, the beginnings and an end in quick succession, the first stirrings during World War II about Army aviation, the 50s where the Air Force and the Army went to and fro and backwards and forwards and got nowhere. The 60s deployments, that was when Army aviation really got back on top. The 70s, the doldrums, and on to the 80s, the transfer and the rapid growth that came with that. And finally, from then on, operations, and more operations. The history of Australian Army aviation began, of course, with the establishment of the first squadron of the Australian Flying Corps in 1913. And while it was a distinguished history, it was short-lived. The formation of the Royal Australian Air Force in 1921 put paid to the Army's being in the aeronautical game. During World War II, there were the first stirrings of Army's renewed interest in aviation. The formation of the Army Air Corps in the UK saw Army pilots flying gliders and directing artillery while flying light aircraft. In Australia, the Army also directed artillery fire while flying in light aircraft, but they were Air Force aircraft and Air Force pilots, with the Army observers on board. The experiment was so successful that the Air Force created 2 AeroP squadrons to carry artillery observers in Oster aircraft. In 1943, Army developed a proposal, that's the Osters from World War II. Army developed a proposal to acquire helicopters to assist in gaining engineer intelligence. The proposal gained some momentum, but stalled when the Air Force got wind of it. The Defence Committee of the day decided that the Air Force should develop the proposal further and sent pilots to the US for rotary wing training. 6 Sikorsky R5s, seen here, were ordered, but the war ended before they were delivered and the order was cancelled. At the time, much of the Australian Army structure and traditions were based on the British Army. And in the late 40s, a senior officer, the Director of Royal Artillery, Brigadier Lewis Dyke, noticed that his establishment included the provision for AeroP pilots. He decided to test the waters, and in 1948, a candidate was found. Major Ken Oram, seen here, met the requirements and was dispatched to the UK to learn how to fly. He qualified on the Oster at the Army Aviation Centre at Middle Wallop, and then he qualified as an instructor at the RAF Central Flying School. He returned to Australia only to find that the negotiations with the RAAF for AeroP pilots was still underway. And indeed, he never flew in the Army. A second pilot was dispatched to the UK for training in 1949 and another in 1949-50. Both completed instructors' courses at CFS. In 1950, the matter of ownership of light aircraft and helicopters was discussed at the Defence Committee, and the RAAF agreed that, quote, provision should be made for light aircraft flown by Army pilots for AeroP, that's Air Observation Post duties. In 1951, the RAAF agreed to provide and maintain light aircraft for Army operations, but declined to supply the pilots, citing the specialist training would be, quote, wasted on light aircraft. The AeroP flight at Fairburn, a remnant of 16 AeroP flight that had been disbanded after the war, was to be the location for the Army pilots to gain their wings. The unit was commanded by the RAAF, who were responsible for all aspects of its operation, although the flying instruction was conducted by Army qualified QFIs. The first tentative steps towards the rebirth of Army aviation had been taken, but tentative they certainly were. On completion of their training, the pilots gained their AeroP wings and then served in the flight for a further 6 months. They then returned to their parent unit and continued to be part of an artillery regiment. They would return periodically to Fairburn for refresher flying, but as you can imagine, this was a less than ideal situation. In 1953, 5 AeroP pilots deployed separately to Korea and served with the British Commonwealth Division. One of these, Lieutenant Joe Luscombe, was shot down and killed in that particular aircraft. And he became the first Army pilot fatality since the First World War. The decision to let Army pilots fly air support missions was not surprising, as the RAAF focus was on entering the jet age, with new fighters, bombers, maritime patrol and transport aircraft. This lack of RAAF attention to Army requirements in the battlefield support role led to considerable tension in relations, particularly regarding the command and control of air support aircraft. Such tensions would again rise with the matter of command and control of battlefield helicopters during and post the Vietnam experience. In 1955, Army again explored the use of rotary wing aircraft. Armies around the world were focused on the prospect of nuclear war and the need for dispersion of forces. In the UK, the Army Service Corps had the lead responsibility, and the Australian Army was following the developments quite closely. The director of the Australian Army Service Corps saw the logistic potential for the use of helicopters, and he summoned Captain Ross Harding, one of his staff, who he knew had an interest in flying an aircraft. Ross found himself in front of the Colonel. "Harding," he said, "I'm sending you off to the UK to do a fixed-wing flying course and then on to the US to qualify on helicopters and become a helicopter instructor." "Certainly, sir," responded Ross, a little surprised. "But I haven't completed any aptitude or medical tests to check if I have the potential." The director's reply was straightforward. "Well, you can drive a truck, can't you?" "Yes, sir." "Then get out there and learn how to fly and stop wasting my time." A very army reaction, I can tell you. In short order, Captain Harding found himself on a ship to the UK, where he gained his wings on the Oster and Chipmunk at Middle Wallop. And then in August of 1955, Ross sailed across the Atlantic and eventually arrived at then Camp Rucker to undertake basic helicopter training on the Belle Sioux, followed by training on the H-19 cargo helicopter, and then back on the Sioux to get his instructor rating. Along the way, he met Igor Sikorsky, visited the Bell Helicopter Company at Fort Worth, Texas, to view the stubby prototype of the Iroquois, and trained with 3 fellow students who were ex-Luftwaffe pilots who had flown with the German Condor Legions during the Spanish Civil War. Return to Australia, however, was a major letdown for Ross when he found that the Army's grand plan for the introduction of helicopters had been again thwarted by the Air Force, and his qualifications were for naught. All was not lost, however, and forward-thinking senior officers arranged for Ross to be attached to the RAN to fly Sycamore helicopters, and he was attached to the Fleet Air Arm for a year. After the year, with the Navy, Ross was again summoned by the Army with what was to become the oft-quoted line, "Flying is not good for your career, soldier." The established AOP arrangements provided some support for Army, but with only 120 hours per month, the demand for air support was wider than just adjusting artillery, and it was not being met. Since the early 50s, the Army had encouraged cadets at Duntroon and senior NCOs to learn how to fly, and it was from among these pilots that the Army formed the first Army Aviation Company, based at Bankstown. The unit was commanded by a senior AOP pilot, had NCO pilots, and flew chartered light aircraft in support predominantly of survey operations in the north of Australia and exercise on the east coast. To this point, the Army had pilots and a unit, but it owned no aircraft. So the acquisition of an Army light aircraft was again raised at the Defence Committee. During its meeting in 1957, the committee noted the Army paper, agreed in principle that the Army should have its own light aircraft, and requested the CGS, the Chief of the General Staff, to provide additional information. Presenting that additional information took 2 more years. By early December 1957, the Army staff had produced another paper which specified 22 light aircraft were required for peacetime, and added 2 Bristol Sycamore helicopters to the list, which, quote, "the Royal Australian Navy has found to be satisfactory service aircraft." This proposal was considered by the Defence Committee in 1957, and while it was generally well received, it still failed for lack of detail. The Chief of the Air Staff, Air Marshal Sir Frederick Sherger, was concerned that Army's proposal would reduce funding available to the Air Force, but he was also keen to resolve the impasse. Again, the committee decided they required more details on costs, and he suggested that a weight limit be placed on Army aircraft, much as was the case in the United Kingdom. This was set at 4,000 pounds gross max all-up weight, and later it was agreed between the CAS and the CGS that Army aircraft would not be armed. With all this dithering, the Sycamores were again not acquired, so Army's attempt to get helicopters stalled once more. By this time, the Oster was well beyond its useful life and Army ordered 8 Cessna 180As, seen here, which were delivered in 1959. These were the first Army aircraft since 1921. With the matter of Army fixed-wing aviation and aircraft ownership apparently settled, the Chief of Staff Committee took the case for Army helicopters in April 1960. Here, Army proposed acquiring 11 helicopters to suit their light reconnaissance requirement. The Army examined the Bell H-13, the Bell Sioux, basically a Model 47 G2, and the Hiller H-23D, seen on the left. And of course, the Sioux got the nod. The COSC endorsed Army's recommendation, and this plan was later agreed by the Minister. Thus, the Army began its path into rotary wing aviation. The final link in the chain to the rebirth of Army aviation was the formation of 16 Army Light Aircraft Squadron. Incidentally, that's a G3B1 for the people that really know. It's not a G2. So the formation of 16 Army Light Aircraft Squadron on the 1st of December 1960. The squadron was located at RAF Amberley and commanded by a very distinguished Air Force officer, Wing Commander Ken Robertson, DFC, AFC and BAR. The chief flying instructor was also an Air Force officer, Squadron Leader Tubby McLaughlin, and as were initially all of the maintenance personnel. The fixed and rotary wing instructors, however, were Army, and yes, the SFI rotary wing was none other than Ross Harding, who had done his refresher course in Fort Rucker with Ken Robertson. Many of the AeroP pilots served in 16 Squadron, and the Army recruited new trainees. One of the clauses in the CGS-CAS agreement was that the Air Force would provide basic flying training at Point Cook for Army students. Army was keen to have NCO pilots, but the staff at 1FTS indicated that they could not accommodate additional NCOs on the base. The compromise was that Army would designate NCO pilots as trainees, as officer cadets, who then had access to the officers' mess and accommodation. Thus, Army's plan for NCO pilots expired on the vine. In December 1960, the Army took delivery of the first Bell Model 47 G2 aircraft, and the first Army helicopter course was run at Amberley in early 61. All the students were relatively experienced AeroP pilots, and while it was the first Army course, it was not the first time the students had handled a helicopter. They had all done a short course on the RAN Sycamore at Nasnara. On completing the Sioux course, the pilots began providing support to Army exercises, while at the same time developing tactics, techniques and procedures to integrate the helicopters into Army. On the fixed-wing side of the house, the Cessnas soon showed their worth, providing support across the country, particularly related to the survey and mapping operations in Northern Australia. It was not long before a call came to deploy an Army helicopter overseas, when in late 1961, 2 Sioux helicopters were loaded on board a Air Force RAF C-130A and flown to Merauke, Dutch West New Guinea. The task was to search for Michael Rockefeller, a son of the Governor of New York and later Vice President of the United States, who had gone missing on an expedition. The Sioux were an Army G2 Alpha and a civilian aircraft with a bigger engine and more performance. Both aircraft were fitted with floats. There were 4 pilots, 1 RAAF and 3 Army, and 4 RAF ground crew. The military pilots were given special dispensation to fly the civilian aircraft. In addition, the RAF had a DC-3 in the area helping with the search. In the event, Rockefeller was not found, and recent studies of the situation have suggested that he fell victim to the local population that was known to practice cannibalism. Just 1 year later, The squadron again deployed 2 Sioux to Dutch West New Guinea, this time on a UN-sponsored mission to control an outbreak of cholera. This time, all 4 pilots were Army with 8 ground crew, RAF. The detachment flew missions for 4 weeks before one of the aircraft was lost in an accident and the detachment was returned to Australia. 16 Army Light Aircraft Squadron continued to grow, and another distinguished Air Force officer, Wing Commander Dick Humphrey, DFC, took command and continued to build the firm aeronautical basis started by Ken Robertson. In 1964, 4 Cessnas made the exploratory trip to Papua New Guinea, carrying out reconnaissance and demonstrations throughout the territory. This paved the way for a permanent aviation detachment to be sent to New Guinea to operate with PNG Command. As the year closed, 16 Army Light Aircraft Squadron was commanded by an Army officer for the first time, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Slocum, who had been one of the AeroP pilots that served in Korea. In June of 1965, the first training course for Army aircraft technicians was completed at RAAF RSTT. This course consisted of RAME, Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, members who had transferred from other trades. A total of 38 persons completed the initial course. Of these, 13 were airframe fitters, 13 engine fitters, 5 instrument fitters, 2 electrical fitters, and 5 radio fitters. Later that year, the first permanent aviation detachment to leave Australia, 2 Cessna 180 aircraft, were deployed to PNG. These aircraft operated in support of the Pacific Islands Regiment, an Australian Army Engineer unit located in the territory, and the PNG Volunteer Rifles. This was followed by the deployment of 182 Recce Flight. A flight was raised at Amberley with 2 Bell 47 G2s and was deployed to Malaya, then Sarawak, in support of 4 RAR operations in the Malayan confrontation. The flight was then redeployed to Terendak in Malaya and thence to Singapore. At this time, the pilot workforce for Army aviation was of a transient nature. Candidates for flying courses came from all branches of the Army and were thus subject to the recall from their parent corps. The "flying is not good for your career, young man," was heard many times by infantrymen, gunners, tankies, signalmen, who were all enjoying their stint flying. In July 1965, 161 Reconnaissance Squadron, or Flight originally, 161 Reconnaissance Flight was raised from 16 Army Light Aircraft Squadron at RAF Base Amberley to deploy to Vietnam with both Army and Air Force technicians. This element was commanded by Major Paul Lipscomb and was the first time since 1918 that an Australian Army unit had been readied for war. Arriving in Vung Tau on the 28th of September 1965, the flight became an integral part of the 1 RAR battalion group which had deployed earlier, and under the operational control of the US 173rd Airborne Brigade. The first operational sortie was carried out on the 22nd of October 1965. It was at this point that a clause in the CGS-CAS agreement delivered a curious outcome. The requirement to have Army aircraft unarmed meant that Army pilots, fixed and rotary wing, conducted low-level missions without defensive weapons beyond a pistol or a rifle. In time, the Cessnas and the Sioux, and the turboporters that replaced them were fitted with 2.75-inch rockets, notionally for target marking purposes, but also pretty handy in deterring ground fire. The rotary wing pilots made do with their pistols and rifles, even when the least, sorry, that's a porter being loaded with rockets, even when the least US Kiowas were introduced, an aircraft fitted for, but in this case, not with, a minigun. 161 moved on to be part of the Australian Task Force in Nui Dat when it was deployed. On the 26th of April 1966, 16 Army Light Aircraft Squadron became the 1st Aviation Regiment in keeping with the Army nomenclature. And on the 1st of July 1969, the Australian Army Aviation Corps was founded. Seniority next after infantry. It provided much needed stability in the workforce, and pilots and support staff could plan for a career in military flying. Officers serving as pilots at the time could choose to return to their parent corps or become blue beret aviators. Needless to say, most chose to stay flying. 161 Squadron would remain in Vietnam for 7 years, completing 88,000 sorties and 72,000 flying hours. 13 aircraft were shot down or crashed, and 3 pilots, including the OC, Major George Constable, were killed in action. The squadron earned 1 MBE, 14 DFC, 1 Queen's Commendation for brave conduct, and 16 mentioned in dispatches. In the 1998 end of war list, a further medal for gallantry and 4 distinguished service medals were awarded to members of the squadron. The time had come, incidentally, that's the aircraft that the OC was flying when he was shot down and killed. The time had come to find a permanent home for the new corps. After much deliberation, the former RAAF airfield at Oakey was selected. 6 Aircraft Depot had occupied the airfield during World War II, but it fell into disuse when the war ended. The Department of Civil Aviation maintained the runways and a small terminal as the Toowoomba Airport, and soon work commenced to build a base for Army aviation. In December 1973, a formation of 25 aircraft, Sioux, Kiowas, Porters and Cessnas, flew out of Amberley and bound for Oakey. They were all going up there for lunch, but the Sioux made it for afternoon tea. I know because I was in one of the Sioux. The Army had spent nearly 13 years on RAF Base Amberley and had been strongly supported by the base personnel throughout. At the farewell dinner, the base commander, Air Commodore Spud Spurgeon, remarked that Army contributed 55% of all aircraft movements on the base and 4% of the fuel used. By that time, the Army occupied Oakey. The School of Army Aviation had been established and conducted flying and ground school training for the pilots and support staff. The 5th Base Workshop provided all the deeper maintenance support for aircraft across the country. 1st Aviation Regiment had a flight at Oakey and Holsworthy, operating the Kiowa and Porter, and rotary flight at Townsville with the Kiowa. The flight in PNG still operated the Sioux. All had integral maintenance sections. The end of the war in Vietnam heralded a period of stagnation for Army aviation. 161 Recce flight was withdrawn to Oakey. The government of the day reduced defence spending significantly. The number of new Kiowa helicopters that had been ordered was reduced, as too were the flying hours available. The main task for the capability was the support of survey operations. That bit there, that was a fairly common occurrence, unfortunately. And there's somebody who's watching from afar is that guy there. So the main task for the capability was in support of survey operations in Indonesia, Irian Jaya, PNG, and Northern Australia. And this is in PNG. And we also employed civilian aircraft. That's the Queen Air, which you'll be familiar with, a couple of our people in the audience that did the Aerodist work. Actually, that's a very telling photograph of the sort of problems that we faced at this period. All of those 44-gallon drums are full. I had 2 Kiowas. I was the only pilot there, but we'd run out of hours. And for 3 weeks, I sat around and counted drums And so we were using Iroquois to do, Kiowa tasks. It's crazy. But anyway, it all happened. The doldrums, as I've described them, lasted until the 1980s, when the Director of Aviation, anticipating the demise of the Iroquois and the introduction of the Black Hawk, developed a paper proposing a better way for the ground commander to manage and control the use of rotary wing assets. Additional papers were developed and progressed up the defence committees until finally a proposal to transfer the RAAF battlefield rotary wing assets to Army reached the Chief of Staff Committee. And these four people comprised the Chief of Staff Committee. At least they were the people who could vote. There were other people present, but these were the three voters. The Chiefs of Staff Committee, the result of their deliberations was a controversial decision to transfer the RAF battlefield helicopters, except the Chinooks, to the Army. This meant that the new Black Hawk helicopter would be introduced into the Air Force and then transferred to the Army. Air Force was already planning to move to 9 Squadron, and the Army concurred with that plan. Army had to find additional manpower resources to accommodate the changes and introduce a short service commission for pilots. In 1988, a skeleton headquarters of the new 5th Aviation Regiment was formed on the RAF base, and in 1989, 9 Squadron moved from Amberley to Townsville, bringing those Black Hawks already delivered with them. Over the next 3 years, the regiment grew. All Black Hawks were delivered, and the ability to lift a company group, which was the fundamental task for the regiment, was demonstrated. I have to say at this juncture that the role played by particularly Wing Commander Angus Houston, but including all of the RAAF officers and airmen in the transfer of 9 Squadron and the setting up of the regiment, was pivotal to our success. In 1989, the Air Force withdrew the Chinooks from service and they were put into storage. 1990, Army also took on the Iroquois, destined for retirement, and they proved to be most worthwhile, particularly as the Black Hawks were being introduced. 5 Squadron RAAF, the Rotary Wing Training Squadron, became the ADF Helicopter School, and in a major rearrangement of Rotary Wing training. Around the same time, Army took on additional N24 stretch Nomads, which resulted in the withdrawal from service of the Pilatus Turbo Porter. In 1993, at very short notice, a detachment of 6 Black Hawks deployed to Cambodia to assist the UN in the UN-sponsored election. The aircraft provided transport and security for the ballot boxes, and the detachment returned to Australia in a matter of weeks. Not long after, however, another detachment of 5 Black Hawks was sent to Bougainville to assist in the peace process. These were followed by a more permanent deployment of Iroquois, while the Black Hawks deployed to PNG and Irian Jaya to help with the devastating droughts in both countries. The absence of the Chinook in the mix was sorely felt by the 5th Aviation Regiment. The movement of fuel, ammunition and stores around the battlefield necessitated the employment of Black Hawks at the expense of the number of people that the Black Hawks could carry. At this time, the US Army was running short of Chinook fuselages, and an innovative plan took shape. Australia would send all 11 C-model Chinooks, one had been lost in an accident, to the US for conversion to D-model, and 4 would be returned to Australia. No money would change hands. It was a great plan, and in no time at all, the Army had 4 Chinooks to reduce the workload on the Black Hawks. In time, the Chinook fleet has grown to 14, and they have proven their worth over and over. In the late 90s, Black Hawk availability collapsed due to insufficient funding for maintenance. An RAAF and Army study group developed a plan to address the problems, which resulted in Army Aviation Support Group being set up at Oakey, focused primarily on the maintenance support to the aircraft. Army had taken over the counter-terrorism role when the transfer occurred. And in June 1996, 2 Black Hawks collided over the high-range training area during training with the SAS. 18 soldiers were killed, including 3 aircrew of one of the aircraft. The accident was a crippling blow to the unit, which had just getting over the support problems. As a result of the accident, Army established 6th Aviation Regiment, whose responsibility was the counter-terrorist role. The regiment was based in Holsworthy, close to the Commando Regiment. Army Aviation was heavily committed to the Australian-led force in East Timor in the late 1990s, and in 2003 deployed 3 Chinooks to Afghanistan to support the US-led force following the 9/11 attacks. Since the war in Vietnam, Army had considered the value of helicopter gunships. A proposal to obtain the Huey Cobra, that is, for the RAAF faded when the war ended, but following the transfer of the battlefield helicopters, Army again raised it for consideration. The likely candidates were reduced to 2, the Eurocopter Tiger and the US Apache. Tiger won the day, and a contract for 22 aircraft and through life support was signed in December 2001. By the turn of the century, the Black Hawks were in need of a midlife upgrade. Instead, it was decided to replace the current S-70A-9 aircraft, and a study was commissioned to find likely contenders. In the end, it came down to 2 aircraft, the Mike model Black Hawk, about to be introduced into the US Army, and the European-built MH90, ordered by a number of European armies. Following the tender evaluation, Defence recommended that the Mike model Black Hawk be used for the job. However, the government of the day preferred the MH90, and that was procured. Both aircraft have had a checkered time in Army, and I'm happy to discuss them in question time, should you ask. If I can just backtrack for a moment and discuss the fixed-wing side of the house. I mentioned earlier the delivery of the N24 aircraft that was surplus to requirement, i.e. they couldn't be sold, and what led then on to the demise of the great Pilatus turboporter. While the Nomad had its good points, it couldn't get to where the Porter could, was a bit underpowered, and was regarded with suspicion by the pilots. It came to a head following 2 fatal accidents, 1 RAAF and 1 Army, in which 5 servicemen died, including 2 PNG students. The Nomad N22 and 24 were withdrawn from service, removing all fixed-wing aircraft from the Army. There followed a period when civil fixed-wing aircraft were chartered, Bandarandis initially, leading up to B200 King Airs and then to the 350 King Airs. Sadly, the demise of the Caribou meant the end of fixed-wing flying in the Army when the B350s were transferred to the Air Force. From 2000 onwards, Army Aviation was almost continually involved in operations or support of the civil community, starting with Bougainville, the Sydney Olympics, floods, bushfires across Australia, commitments in East Timor, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, neighbouring islands, and across Australia. Delays in the delivery of both MRH, MH90, and the Tiger meant that the load fell on the Black Hawks and the Chinooks. In 2021, as the last Black Hawks were being withdrawn from service, the government of the day announced the purchase of 40 Mike model Black Hawks, which was to be followed up by the purchase of Apache gunships. It was the right decision, just 20 years too late. Also in 2021, the Army established the Aviation Command. Oh, that's a Mike model Black Hawk. Can't tell the difference really. And that's the Apache. And the Army established Aviation Command led by Major General Steve Jobson. That streamlined the command chain and simplified the structure. For the first time in its history, Army aviators answered directly up the structure populated by aviation officers to the 2-star level. One of the earliest decisions taken by the Commander Aviation was a move of the 16th Aviation Brigade headquarters to Townsville, to be followed by the move of the 1st Aviation Regiment from Darwin to Townsville, probably when the Apaches arrive. There is no move for the 6th Aviation Regiment, maintaining its close association with Special Forces Command. It's been a long road since the early 40s, with success and tragedy along the way, and it remains to be seen what the future will bring. Thank you. As I say, I'm happy to take questions.
Might I make just
Oh,
two quick
certainly.
comments myself?
Yes,
You mentioned Luscombe being the first guy to be killed.
yes.
You didn't mention how he was remembered.
Oh,
Luscombe
well,
Field?
yes, Luscombe Airfield, yes.
Yes. Luscombe Airfield in Newey
First
Gap.
in Newey Dat and then in Holsworthy and then up in Darwin.
That's right.
Yeah.
The day I arrived in Vietnam was the day the first of the turbo porters crashed and killed those
Oh,
guys.
yes, yeah, that was
I didn't
dreadful.
know that at the time, but I subsequently discovered that those two dates are identical.
Yeah, yeah. No, that was dreadful, that accident.
Right.
That was brand new, just arrived. That was shot down by somebody. Yeah, well, it suffered damage from gunfire.
Yeah, I had a question about the transfer of the rotary wing to the army. I always understood that was a Beasley, the minister's.
No,
off
no, the
wing.
minister had nothing to do with it whatsoever. That's a common misconception. It was all the committee. There was toing and froing within the committee, and there are some Air Force people who are not very happy with the Navy people, but that's by the by. But it was a decision of the Chiefs of Staff Committee that was then ratified by the minister. But he wasn't going to go against that, I don't think.
The myth often told to me was that Beasley came back from the US having fielded questions from the US services of why do we do it that way, and but if it was done in committee, I accept that.
No, that wouldn't have had anything to do with it, I don't think.
What was the rationale for the Vietnam aircraft not to be armed?
It was an arbitrary decision or an agreement. I mean, it wasn't just a decision, it was an agreement between the Chief of Air Force and the Chief of Army, as they were different names in those days, that they wouldn't be armed.
And the pilots did not have any input into that decision.
No, even to the point where somebody approached, when we got the Kiowas, the leased Kiowas, an Air Force officer who was on the staff in Saigon came up and spoke to the Chief of Staff of the brigade, didn't even talk to any of the aviators, and said, "Do you think these things should be armed?" They said, "No, okay." Nobody spoke to the CO or the OC, who became very irate when he discovered. But he subsequently said that, frankly, it didn't make much of a difference at that time. But I've always found it to be curious to be sending people off to be shot at and not being able to shoot back.
Bill, would you like to make a comment about the use of the Porters being a Swiss aircraft? As I understood it, there was some kind of loose agreement that they wouldn't be used in a combat situation, but we took them there. So how did we get around that?
Well, I'm not sure about it, but my understanding is that there was no agreement until such time as one was shot down. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was the one that you were talking about. And then the Swiss got all up in arms and said,
Only then.
that's my understanding. I don't know, is that right?
Yeah, that's probably about right.
Yeah.
That was already written down.
No. And besides which, we kept them there. I mean, the Swedes also stopped the ammunition flow for the Carl Gustaf when they found out that we were using Carl Gustaf there. So you've got to be careful who you buy from.
Anybody online?
Graham Aspinall, Bob.
Yep, go for it.
Bill, why was the Porter withdrawn? I understand it's a very capable aircraft, very robust, and did the job well. Why was it withdrawn in the very end? Can you tell?
Well, basically, we couldn't afford to keep them on whilst we had the additional Nomads and the N24s.
Mm-hmm.
So it was purely an economy measure.
Mhm.
It was very sad. I mean, nobody who's ever flown a Porter wanted that to happen.
Thank you, Bill. Look- Okay, thanks, everybody. That's the end of the meeting.
Yeah.